American writer William Faulkner once said, "To understand the world, you have to understand a place like Mississippi." But that's easier said than done, unless you discover it from the air. Soar over its vast, fertile delta, ancient trails, and sunlit Gulf Coast, but also the devastation wrought by its surging floods and terrifying tornadoes that can level entire towns. It's here where America's great river deposited the planet's richest soil that once grew the cotton that clothed the world, but that gave rise to centuries of struggle and the birth of the blues. It was in a small Mississippi church where a young girl named Oprah first discovered her talent to entertain. In centuries past, dancers here celebrated the great Sun King. Now, hot rodders celebrate the king of rock and roll. On Mississippi soil, civil rights leaders were born, and Civil War defeats are still mourned. But that's just part of this southern state's story. It's also where 21st century soldiers mobilize to be deployed around the world. And America's future in space is just one launch away. All this in a place called Mississippi. The slow but powerful rhythms that define Mississippi begin with the river that gives the state its name. Called Father of Waters by the Native American Ojibwe tribe, the Mississippi rolls some 2,350 miles through the heartland of America. Virtually every raindrop that falls between the Appalachian Mountains and the Continental Divide eventually finds its way down this mythic waterway. The river's course, in most places, marks Mississippi's western border. It moves goods, deposits fertile soil, and has played a strategic role in history. But when the Big Muddy overflows its banks, it ravages crops, homes, and lives. In 2011, the Mississippi broke all records when the surge rose higher than 57 feet. The flood swept inland more than 60 miles, swamping golf courses and houses. But it's farmers that bear the brunt. This year, Mississippi farms had more than $250 million in losses. But it could get a whole lot worse. When the river floods, water seeps through the levees and even tops over them. But if these man-made barriers give way, millions could be affected. Luckily for now, Mississippi's levees are holding. Whenever water rises, livestock head for high ground. Wild animals, like this American alligator, can be swept away by floodwaters. Some have even been known to wash into people's living rooms. But high water doesn't touch these colonies of herons and egrets. In the treetops of this forested floodplain, they're right at home. From the air, it's possible to get a rare view of these nesting birds, which are usually only spotted standing solitary in shallow waters. For people, flooding inflicts tremendous losses. The water can take weeks to recede. But for the 12,000 years that humans have occupied this land, they have accepted the river's dangers in exchange for its gifts. Centuries before Europeans arrived, Mississippi's original inhabitants, the Natchez people, built this earthen structure. Attracted by the river, fertile soil, and warm climate, they settled here in what's now southwestern Mississippi. Skilled at agriculture, their population swelled. This giant earthen structure covers 8 acres. Called Emerald Mound, It's one of the largest Native American ceremonial mounds in the country. People from surrounding villages gathered here and ascended the mound to participate in important ceremonies. By the late 1600s, the Natchez abandoned the site and moved closer to the river. Just a few miles away, they established a new community, the Grand Village of the Natchez. Here at an annual powwow, Native Americans from all over the country gather for a weekend of crafts, games, and dancing. Houses like this one once dotted Grand Village, along with the home of the tribe's chief, who was called Great Sun. It was Plains Indians who first gathered in ceremonial circles for warrior dances. Today, flag-bearing war veterans are leading members of the Ponca, Choctaw, Oto, and Omaha tribes. Their steps aren't choreographed. Dancers let the drums and the spirit move them. Grand Village grew to become the prosperous frontier port of Natchez. Today, residents take their daily exercise past the once notorious Natchez Wharf. In the 19th century, boatmen disembarked here to spend their pay in the saloons and brothels of the dockside area. According to Mark Twain, this street was once overrun with drinking, carousing, fisticuffing, and killing. But this little trading port has another more surprising history. At one point, more than half of the millionaires in America lived in this small city on the bluffs of the Mississippi. That's because by the mid-1800s, the cotton gin and slavery had made the South rich, and Natchez had become a primary cotton hub and slave market, making the town wealthier per capita than any other in the nation. In 1862, during the Civil War, Natchez surrendered to Union forces and remained largely undamaged. 500 antebellum structures survive here, more than in any other town in the South. Some, like Dunley Historic Inn, stand as a monument to the days when cotton was king. But others look more like relics of a lost civilization. Discovering Mississippi from the air, it can seem like a place where time stands still, especially here at Longwood. In 1860, a wealthy cotton planter named Dr. Haller Nutt had plans for an opulent 32-room mansion. It was designed in the shape of an octagon, a popular trend at the time. But the next year, when the Civil War broke out, the workers dropped their tools and fled, leaving their job only half done. To this day, the interior of this grand house has never been completed. But that didn't stop producers from using it as the home of the dangerous and powerful vampire king of Mississippi in the television series True Blood. Just a few miles from Longwood lies the starting point of one of America's great scenic highways. This is the Natchez Trace. It heads northeast out of Natchez and runs for 444 miles through the heart of Mississippi, before continuing on up to Nashville, Tennessee. The trace started as a path made by migrating bison and was later used by Native American traders. In the 19th century, rivermen from Ohio used the trace to return home by foot after delivering their goods to Natchez. Flush with their profits sewn into deerskin bags, these travelers were easy prey for a colorful array of thieves and outlaws that plied their trade all along the trace. The most notorious of these were the Harp brothers, who have been called America's first serial killers. They were said to have brutally killed more than 40 people. One of the brothers was finally beheaded and his skull mounted on a stake and left on the trace. Those days are long gone. Today, development is the biggest threat on this two-lane roadway. It's one reason the National Park Service has banned billboards and works to ensure that the forests all along the trace remain intact. Forests that look much like they have for centuries. But across much of Mississippi, cutting down trees is a billion-dollar business. Most of the state's commercially grown forests, like these, contain longleaf pine, which is used to make newsprint, furniture, and lumber. Logging in Mississippi has been big business for more than a century. But recently, economic woes have resulted in huge layoffs for the state's timber workers. And now, the trees themselves are under attack from an invasive vine. From high above, this Mississippi landscape may look at first like plush velvet, but closer up, it's not such a pretty picture. These trees and hillsides are covered in kudzu, otherwise known as the vine that ate the South. Imported from Japan and originally promoted as cattle fodder and ground cover, it's now considered a scourge, smothering trees, even knocking down power lines. Kudzu can grow a foot per day and now covers millions of acres across the South. But there is one way to combat this species. Smoke rises over a pine forest in southern Mississippi. This fire has been lit on purpose. Long before Europeans arrived, Native Americans set Mississippi forests ablaze to clear land for hunting. Today, prescribed burns remove competing undergrowth, destroy harmful insects and diseases, and make it easier for loggers to cut their trees. Fires like these must be carefully managed. The slightest shift in wind can cause these flames to spread out of control. But in 2011, it wasn't a prescribed burn, but a terrifying force of nature that destroyed much of this Mississippi town in just a matter of minutes. At 3:44 p.m. on April 27, 2011, an E5 tornado, the most extreme category recordable, tore through Monroe County, Mississippi, near the Alabama border. In this rural land, it's more likely that a tornado will just hit farmland or forest. But this twister, touching down for almost 3 miles, screamed down a main highway and tore right through this town called Smithville. Its path of destruction was 3/4 of a mile wide. Its winds reached 205 miles per hour. 17 people were killed here, in a town of just 900. Relief workers arrived within hours, setting up camp in the parking lot of this shredded Piggly Wiggly supermarket. Although this was the first E5 to hit Mississippi in 45 years, tornadoes are frequent occurrences in the state. 2 of the 5 deadliest twisters in U.S. history struck in Mississippi. In Smithville, families seek what they can salvage. Half of the town's houses are simply gone. The high school gym was ripped apart. The tombstones of Civil War soldiers were toppled and broken. North of Smithville, great pines snapped like toothpicks as the twister raced out of town just as fast as it had arrived. Mississippians are experienced survivors. They've seen it all: storms, floods, poverty, and war. In the city of Jackson sits the state capital, the political center of modern Mississippi. Jackson is Mississippi's only city with more than 100,000 residents. Established in 1821, it was named for the hugely popular hero of the Battle of New Orleans before he was elected president. But it's the old state capital that remains the symbol of the great conflict that lies at the heart of Mississippi memory. On January 9, 1861, Mississippi declared itself the second state to secede from the Union. Partisans still argue the causes of the war, but the Mississippi Ordinance of Secession clearly defined the state's motivation. It was read aloud from this second-story balcony. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. After it was read, celebrations rang out on the streets below, but not for long. Civil War battles soon raged all over the state, and the cities of Port Gibson, Jackson, and Vicksburg became key battlegrounds in what's known as the Vicksburg Campaign. By 1863, Confederate forces at Vicksburg were still in control of the lower Mississippi River, which is why President Lincoln told his advisors, "Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." On April 30th, General Ulysses Grant and his Army of the Tennessee crossed the river from Louisiana and began the invasion of Mississippi. When they reached Port Gibson, the general and his men might have wondered at the gold hand pointing to heaven. This newer version still caps the spire of the First Presbyterian Church. The Union troops quickly overcame the Confederate forces here, but Grant spared most of Port Gibson itself, reportedly calling the town too beautiful to burn. Still today, many of its houses look just as they did more than a century ago. The victory at Port Gibson enabled the Union Army to continue on toward Jackson. Grant hoped to destroy key railroad lines and neutralize the capital. On May 13th, a Confederate general sent to protect Jackson arrived in the city by train. After reviewing his inadequate defenses against the approaching enemy, he wired his superior, "I am too late." The next day, the Confederates evacuated Jackson as Grant's troops marched in. They set most of the city ablaze, but spared the deserted governor's mansion so it could serve as a hospital, and raised the stars and stripes over the old state capitol. With Jackson burning, Grant was now ready to march on Vicksburg. 3 days later, as Union forces moved west, they met Confederate resistance here on the banks of the Big Black River. Overwhelmed by Northern numbers, the Southerners retreated over a bridge that stood near this one. Many of them were captured or drowned trying to swim the river. Confederate commanders set fire to the bridge, which helped buy the survivors time to reach Vicksburg and prepare for the coming assault. The legacy of that campaign still permeates the city. Lincoln's phrase that Vicksburg was the key to the South is now used as a tourism campaign. When Grant finally reached the city, he ordered a series of immediate attacks. But his forces were repulsed, suffering heavy losses. Grant decided that cutting off supplies and laying siege to the city was the best hope for victory. Day and night, Union forces shelled Vicksburg. The courthouse was a favorite target, but more for its symbolic rather than strategic value. Most of the key battlegrounds lay here in what's now the Vicksburg National Military Park, which commemorates the siege and defense of the city. While Southern troops fought bravely, their efforts could not replenish dwindling supplies of food and water. After 47 days, with Vicksburg's defenders facing starvation, Confederate General John C. Pemberton surrendered to Ulysses Grant here under an oak tree, which was later cut down to make souvenirs. The Confederates marched out on July 4th, 1863, one day after Robert E. Lee's defeat at Gettysburg. In a letter to his wife, a Confederate soldier wrote, "News reached here that Vicksburg has gone up the spout. If it has, we had just as well quit and give up the Confederacy." Indeed, the entire Mississippi River, from Cairo, Illinois to the Gulf of Mexico, was now under Union control. Although the war dragged on for another 20 months, the Federal victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg mark the turning point of this bloody conflict. The defeat of the Confederacy was a crushing blow to the South, economically, culturally, and psychologically. Following the July 4th defeat, Vicksburg did not reinstate Independence Day celebrations for more than 80 years, until 1945. Nevertheless, the South continues to take pride in its military history, and to this day contributes a disproportionate number of soldiers to wars fought by the United States. Soldiers like these, preparing to board their Black Hawk, and the pilots that fly this C-130 Hercules aircraft. It's just a day in the life here at Mississippi's Camp Shelby, the largest state-run field training site in the United States. First opened to prepare soldiers for World War I, it has expanded to cover more than 134,000 acres. Throughout the year, Camp Shelby prepares more than 100,000 Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force troops for overseas deployment. In the midst of the camp, sitting quietly in the Mississippi sun, are two mock Middle Eastern villages, complete with buildings designed to look like mosques. Here, soldiers heading overseas can train in what the Guard believes are more realistic settings. Troops deploy from Camp Shelby, prepared to fight wars in distant regions of the world. But soldiers aren't Mississippi's only native sons and daughters to leave their mark on history. One of the most loved entertainers in America started her remarkable journey in the rural town of Kosciuszko, just off the Natchez Trace Parkway, northeast of Jackson. 50 years ago, this white clapboard community center was a church. Inside, a precocious 3-year-old named Oprah Winfrey was encouraged to stand and recite Bible passages to the congregation. Oprah remembers, and all the sisters sitting in the front row would turn to my grandmother and say, "Hattie Mae, this child is gifted." I heard that enough. I started to believe it. Oprah spent her first 6 years on her grandmother's farm just down the road. Some of her family members are buried in this cemetery. From Kosciuszko, the Natchez Trace continues on into the Northeast Hills region. Here, Mississippi's flatlands give way to gentle rises, preparing to meet the foothills of Tennessee. Some say that it's the unique blend of cultures in this region, from African American to Appalachian hillbilly, that produces creative genius. Visitors to Tupelo would have to agree. On a January dawn in 1935, inside this 2-room White House, twin boys were born to Vernon and Gladys Presley. The first was stillborn. The surviving boy was named Elvis. The home is just 450 square feet, with no indoor plumbing. There's a sofa at Graceland longer than this entire house. Despite the home's modesty, the Presleys were unable to make the payments. Elvis and his parents moved from home to home for years. Family and faith, though, stayed constant. This simple white Assembly of God church, where the Presleys often worshiped, was moved here, next to the birthplace. And it was inside these walls that gospel music first entranced the young Elvis. But when Mrs. Presley brought Elvis here to Tupelo Hardware to get him a guitar for his 11th birthday, what the boy really wanted was a rifle. Fortunately, Mother prevailed. The people of Tupelo, of course, relished their link to the king. Every spring, townspeople here combine their love of rock and roll and their infatuation with cars in the annual Blue Suede Cruise. They may look like Matchbox cars from the air, but they are full-scale classics and hot rods gathered in the parking lot of the Tupelo Automobile Museum. It's a car lover's paradise. The long line of beauties moves out on Saturday morning to parade through downtown Tupelo. Drivers can be eligible for prizes as long as they get their entry card stamped at 7 sites around town, including Elvis's birthplace. After the parade, cruisers can find rare parts at the swap meet or rock out to the fabulous hubcaps. An hour's drive due west from Tupelo, the spotlight shifts from rock and roll royalty to lions of literature. This is Oxford, Mississippi, on the day of the annual Double-Decker Arts Festival. Named for the double-decker bus the city imported from England in 1994 to honor its connection to the other Oxford. The Oxford Town Square, dominated by the Lafayette County Courthouse, embodies the complexity of Mississippi culture and history. On one side of the courthouse stands a plaque commemorating the just and holy cause of the Confederacy. On the other side stands Square Books, one of the most beloved independent bookstores in the country. Shelves are filled with the works of Mississippi writers, Eudora Welty, Tennessee Williams, and Richard Wright. Novelist Richard Ford observed that his home state produced so many writers because it is so complicated, it takes that many to interpret it. In Oxford, the town favorite is Nobel Prize-winning novelist William Faulkner. Tucked within this grove of oak and cedar trees is Roanoke, the antebellum house where Faulkner lived for 40 years. Here, he wrote the classics Sanctuary, Light in August, Absalom, Absalom, and Go Down Moses. His plot outline for The Fable remains penciled on his study wall. Faulkner said that his own little postage stamp of native soil was worth writing about, and that he would never live long enough to exhaust it. Just about anywhere you go in Mississippi, there are stories to tell. Like that of Rodney, which was transformed from a bustling port city to a ghost town, just because the mighty Mississippi changed its course. And then there are these ghostly columns that look like the ruins of a Greek temple. This once elegant mansion was the centerpiece of the 2,600-acre Windsor plantation. It had 25 rooms and a dairy in its basement. Windsor survived the Civil War, but was brought down by a stray cigarette at an afternoon party. But there's one story in Mississippi that thousands still hold dear. And it's why die-hard fans of the University of Mississippi consider their football stadium a place of worship. Some Ole Miss loyalists will claim that divine intervention was at play at the 1983 Egg Bowl, the annual collision between the Ole Miss Rebels and the Mississippi State Bulldogs. Ole Miss had overcome an early deficit to gain a 1-point lead by the fourth quarter. But with just seconds remaining, the visiting Bulldogs lined up on the 10-yard line, ready to kick a field goal to victory. The kick was made, perfectly aimed between the goalposts. But just as the ball began to sail through, a gust of wind picked it up and tossed it back outside the posts. Rebel pandemonium ensued. A newspaper reporter called it the Immaculate Deflection. Students at Ole Miss know how to celebrate a victory. Here at Sigma Nu's spring party, Woodstock is the theme, and tie-dye is everywhere. But it wasn't always peace and love at the University of Mississippi. In the center of campus, a monument depicts a young man striding purposefully toward a doorway. It's a tribute to James Meredith, the young African-American Air Force veteran who became, in 1962, the first black student to attend the University of Mississippi. It took U.S. Marshals to control the violent riots that followed. 2 people were killed and hundreds arrested. But Ole Miss was forever changed. Since then, students have developed a strong commitment to justice. One of them was a 26-year-old who earned his law degree from Ole Miss in 1981. Then, inspired by the injustices he witnessed in the state's courtrooms, he began to write legal thrillers. His name was John Grisham. The books have gone on to become international bestsellers, but Grisham himself didn't go far. He lives on this estate outside of Oxford for part of the year. An avid sports fan, he built a baseball diamond on the property for local Little League teams. Here in Oxford, Mississippi's authors take the fame. But west of the hills, on the other side of the Yazoo River, lies a place that gave birth to an entirely different art form, the legendary Delta Blues. It all started here, where some of the most fertile soil in the world stretches on for mile after mile. It's known as the Mississippi Delta region. But one thing it is not, technically speaking, is a delta. The Mississippi River Delta lies 300 miles to the south in Louisiana, where the Mississippi River flows into the Gulf of Mexico. But the Mississippi Delta region lies far from the Gulf, framed to the west by the Mississippi and to the east by the Yazoo River. It's what's called an alluvial plain, an area created by the fertile sediment deposited by eons of river flooding. The delta is flat, hot, and wet. But for more than 2 centuries, those working its rich soil have been oppressively poor. Delta culture is deeply influenced by this history of struggle, but also grounded in an abiding love for the land. The late writer and Delta native Willie Morris wrote, "This incredible Delta land consumed and shaped me. I love it beyond all measure, and I fear it too. It is what I am, and always will be, till I die." The Delta's greatest asset is its loamy topsoil that extends down as far as 350 feet, which is why Mississippi's #1 industry is agriculture, in all its varied forms. And that includes fish. This grid of giant ponds supplies 55% of catfish consumed in the U.S., from famous southern fried catfish to frozen products that ship out across the nation. In recent years, though, competition from Asian fish farmers is crowding Mississippians out of the U.S. market. In addition, the price of fish feed has risen. Many aqua farmers are draining their ponds so they can grow and sell corn and soy instead of buying it to feed their fish. Today, all kinds of crops are grown in the Delta, but none has shaped this land like cotton. On this spring day, one Delta field is being prepped for planting. It's a tricky season for cotton farmers. They want to get their seeds into the ground early in the year, when it's still moist. But a sudden spring chill could stop those seeds from sprouting. Cotton is always a gamble here in the Delta, but for 2 centuries, it's been one Mississippi farmers have been willing to take. In the early 1800s, worldwide demand for cotton skyrocketed. The black Delta soil was perfect for the crop, and slave labor made Mississippi plantation owners rich. By 1850, cotton accounted for half of all U.S. exports. Without cotton, there likely would never have been a civil war, and the history of Mississippi would have run a far different course. Today, if no longer king, cotton is still an important crop. Mississippi ranks second to Texas in cotton production, and 80% of the state's crop is grown right here in the Delta. But as soon as the seeds go into the ground, they're attacked by weeds. The best way to tackle these pests is from the air. When spraying herbicides, crop dusters fly at only 8 to 12 feet above the ground. That's a dangerous occupation at 140 miles per hour. But for many crop dusting pilots like this one, there's no greater job in the world. Most of the cotton in the Delta has been genetically modified so that the herbicide will kill the weeds, but not the cotton. But it can also kill other plants, insects, and birds. Farmers get no easy answers. Despite mechanization, the work is still physically demanding. And between the weather and the weeds, it's always a game of chance. Long before today's crop dusters and tractors, Mississippi's fields were all tended by hand. First by slaves, and then by dirt-cheap labor. These shacks once housed sharecroppers. They'd work the land for a share of the profits. But landowners saw to it that they'd always owe more than they earned. The system began to dissolve in the 1960s as machines began to take over the work of farming. But today, Delta counties still rank among the poorest in the nation. At the Shack Up Inn, located on a former plantation outside of Clarksdale, authentic sharecropper cabins have been updated with indoor plumbing, air conditioning, and coffee makers. They house tourists seeking the blues experience or a game of golf. For blues pilgrims, Clarksdale is Mecca. Just outside town, Highway 61 crosses over Highway 49. Legend has it that it was at this crossroads that Delta bluesman Robert Johnson made a deal with the devil, selling his soul in exchange for supernatural guitar skills. The blues grew a reputation for being the devil's music. The idea was that it must be bad for it to sound so good. In the first half of the 20th century, Clarksdale was the big town of the Delta, where folks went to spend money and have a good time. Juke joints filled the town. Many, like Red's Lounge, still operate to this day. Sharecroppers pass through shabby storefronts like this one to hear a new music. An earthy blend of African rhythms, spiritual hymns, and the field hollers of hard labor. It grew out of the darkest reaches of life, but was always balanced by a wry humor. Much of Clarksdale's heritage is housed here at the Delta Blues Museum, located in the old freight depot. It celebrates the musicians who are closely associated with the town: Charlie Patton, Son House, Robert Johnson, Muddy Waters, John Lee Hooker, Sam Cooke, and Ike Turner. Some blues musicians never left the Delta. Others, like Muddy Waters, did. It's said he boarded a bus right here at this station and joined the 6 million other black Southerners in the Great Migration North. "I'm going to pack my suitcase," Muddy sang, "and make my getaway." The exposure Muddy Waters' music found in Chicago launched the Delta Blues into the mainstream. It's influenced musicians around the world. But it's Clarksdale that remains ground zero for the blues. That's also the name of this blues club, co-owned by actor and Mississippi native Morgan Freeman. Ground Zero sometimes books national acts, but in the Delta, there's always plenty of local talent. In 1967, native singer-songwriter Bobby Gentry sang of this river, the Tallahatchie, in the hugely popular ballad Ode to Billy Joe. In the song, Billy Joe McAllister jumps off the Tallahatchie Bridge. But the real tragedy of the Tallahatchie took place 12 years earlier. In the summer of 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till traveled from Chicago to visit his mother's family here in the tiny town of Money, Mississippi. This decrepit vine-covered building was then the busy Bryant Grocery. On August 24th, 1955, after the young Emmett went inside to buy bubble gum, the store's owner, a white woman, quickly left. Some believe she was upset because Emmett had either whistled at her or touched her hand or waist. A week later, Emmett Till's mangled body came to the surface of the Tallahatchie. The woman's husband and brother-in-law had taken Emmett from his bed in the middle of the night. The two men were tried for murder here at the Tallahatchie County Courthouse, but they were acquitted after just 1 hour of jury deliberation. The next year, in a paid interview for Look magazine, the two men admitted killing the Chicago teenager. The national outrage that followed marked a defining moment in the rising civil rights movement. "When you live in Mississippi," wrote Willie Morris, "you cannot escape race, because it is in its deepest, convoluted being and in the very soil." Mississippi has a higher proportion of African Americans than any other state, and racial relationships have changed dramatically since 1955. Prosecutors in the state have reinvestigated 22 civil rights era deaths, leading to 16 convictions, including one for the murder of Medgar Evers, an activist who had investigated the death of Emmett Till and aided James Meredith's struggle. Change doesn't come quickly, though. Morgan Freeman, who lives on this estate outside Charleston, made an unusual offer in 1997. The actor said that he'd pay for a prom for Charleston High School if black and white students could attend together. It wasn't until 2008, 11 years later, that the school finally accepted Freeman's offer and held its first integrated prom. The past is never far away in Mississippi, but the state is embracing the future in sometimes surprising ways. Mississippi may be losing jobs in the farming and forestry sectors, but the state's automotive industry is growing. It's added 5,000 jobs in the last decade, including 3,300 at this Nissan plant in Canton. In 2003, a Quest minivan became the first automobile to roll off a Mississippi assembly line. Stretching over 14,000 acres, the Nissan facility is like a small city with a medical clinic and bank. In the main building, which is 7/10 of a mile long, plant workers produce up to 400,000 vehicles each year. Moving further south toward the coast, the past recedes even more. The view in Hancock County is downright futuristic. In 1961, NASA announced that it had chosen this Mississippi site to build a facility to test rocket engines for the Apollo lunar landing program. Locals were fond of saying, if you want to go to the moon, you first have to go through Hancock County, Mississippi. The site, now called the Stennis Space Center, was chosen for its access to the Gulf via the Pearl River, and because the vast surrounding forest land could act as a sound buffer. From the Saturn V rockets that boosted astronauts toward the moon, through all the years of space shuttle flights, the engines that provided the exhilarating liftoff were tested here. Now, for the first time since the 60s, a new test stand is being built at Stennis. 2,000 tons of steel encase an enormous chamber. Inside, NASA will test its next generation of rocket engines, which may someday carry humans into deep space. In 2005, these towering test stands survived the howling winds of one of the worst storms on record in the United States, Hurricane Katrina. But more than 90% of the structures that used to line Mississippi's once pristine coast weren't so lucky. Natural forces have always battered Mississippi's 44-mile-long Gulf Coast, wedged between Alabama and Louisiana. 8 miles off the mainland lies Cat Island, a barrier island created by colliding Gulf of Mexico currents. The island reportedly got its name from resident raccoons that French explorers mistook for cats. While most Gulf islands are primarily sand, Cat Island's beaches are backed by forests of pine and oak. The marshes here are home to alligators and migrating birds. During World War II, Cat Island was the site of the U.S. Army's classified War Dogs program, which experimented with training canines for combat. Nearby lie 2 barrier islands, East Ship and West Ship. They were once a single island until the force of Hurricane Camille in 1969 sliced the landmass in 2. On West Ship stands the 19th century fort used by Union forces to stage the capture of New Orleans in 1862. Soon after the war, Fort Massachusetts was abandoned. Frequent storms have made it hard to maintain the fort. But nothing compares with the most recent streak of bad luck here on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Within 5 years, the region suffered one of the most devastating storms on record, Hurricane Katrina, and the biggest accidental oil spill in history, the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon. Those events, plus an economic recession and cheap foreign imports, have pummeled Mississippi's fishing industry, second only to Louisiana in the Gulf states. Still, the boats head out into the Sound. The Captain Wick trawls for shrimp in these brackish waters. Even in the best of times, shrimping is a tough and precarious way of life. But it's a business that is still handed down from generation to generation in Mississippian families. Despite the blows suffered by the fishing and tourist industries during the 2010 oil spill, the state's residents express strong support for continued offshore oil exploration and drilling. This giant drilling rig is being built on the banks of the Mississippi River. The 3 unfinished tower-like structures are actually the rig's legs. When in place, they will anchor the huge floating platform to the ocean floor. The completed rig will be pushed and slid into the Mississippi and then towed downriver to its final destination in the Gulf. Offshore has another meaning in Mississippi, unrelated to oil. The state legalized gambling casinos on the Mississippi River and the coast in 1990 in an effort to jolt a stagnant economy. The initiative was a notable success. New floating casinos soon gave the state one of the largest gambling industries in the nation. But that boom ended on August 29, 2005, when Hurricane Katrina made landfall in Mississippi. The coastal town of Waveland, 50 miles northeast of New Orleans, has been called the epicenter of the storm. In New Orleans, the devastation was mostly caused by catastrophic levee failures, but here, Katrina made a direct hit as a Category 3 storm. Even now, foundations remain bare from the assault. 125-mile-per-hour winds and a 30-foot storm surge raged across the coast, killing 238 people and obliterating 95% of buildings on the shoreline. Katrina rampaged north through the state, her hurricane-force winds and tornadoes knocking out power to nearly a third of Mississippi's residents. 70,000 homes were destroyed. Shock eventually gave way to rebuilding. Mississippi's restoration has been called a model for disaster recovery. The state channeled $5 billion in federal funds to housing, infrastructure, and economic development. This new Bay St. Louis bridge replaced the old one destroyed by Katrina. Just 20 months after the storm, the new bridge was completed, 55 feet taller this time, in the hope that it will withstand the next great surge. When the roadway reopened, coastal communities were reconnected. And once again, freight trains carrying the Gulf Coast's paper and petroleum products are rolling out across the nation. Standing in the median of Highway 90, the Biloxi Lighthouse could hardly be a more fitting symbol for this Gulf Coast community, or Mississippi in general. The cast iron structure has withstood more than a century and a half of hurricanes, frequently damaged but never destroyed, linked to the past but standing resiliently to meet the future. Mississippi. land of warmth and hospitality. Coexisting with a sometimes tortured history. Deeply connected to the land, yet striving toward new sources of prosperity. W. Ralph Eubanks wrote that Mississippi inhabits and haunts me. Its music and rhythms, both the joyful and the melancholy, have followed me my entire life, even when I tried to run away from them. Mississippi inspires a passionate connection in those who claim her as their own.